Right, just had an announcement that we can keep going beyond the 40 minutes, which is probably just as well. Right, so we're at Keynsham, and that is a more recent, obviously, but it's a picture of Keynsham Bridge. Vital crossing point of the River Avon, as I've said. It got as far as some of the rebel army did actually cross the bridge onto the Gloucester bank, but there they were attacked by Royalist cavalry, and although they didn't do too badly in the battle, essentially Monmouth lost his nerve at this point. He realised that the Royalist army was on his heels. It looked as though he would not be able to take Bristol, and so he really lost his strategic direction. And of course, as soon as an army, particularly an amateur army such as we're talking about here, loses its direction, then you are in deep trouble. So the map again, from Keynsham, he headed towards Bath. From there, Philip Norton, as it was called then, now Norton St Phillips, Norton St Phillips, Frome, Shepton Mallet, Wells, and down to just the outskirts of Bridgewater. Bath is rather sad in a way, insofar as the idea was he was asking Bath to open its gates for him, for his army. And the burghers of Bath, Bath being a strongly royalist town, closed their gates to him and were up on the battlements mocking his army as they marched by, because Monmouth didn't stand a chance in the time available of seizing Bath by force. They ended up as what we now call Norton St Philip. He stayed the night, Monmouth, in the building. It wasn't the George Inn at the time, but it was now the George Inn, which is that, those of you know the place, is that big building right on the crossroads that totally obscures your view when you're trying to pull out. You know, there's a legacy of his time there. And so the army moved back to Bridgewater. Now I say the army insofar as, of course, dispirited. Many of the men, literally their shoes would have worn out by then. They were wet, tired, hungry, dispirited, lacking direction. Monmouth's intention originally in going past Bath to Frome had been to march on Warminster and hence get to London. But again, the Royalist army was really blocking that avenue, and so it was a dispirited force that went its way back to Bridgewater. Difficult to know how many men were left with him by the time he got there. Probably, and notice the word probably, at its peak his army probably numbered about 8,000 men. But by the time he got back to Bridgewater, a significant number of them would have deserted, realised that they were in deep trouble, to put it bluntly, that there wasn't much chance of winning and that the repercussions could be quite enormous. And I can quite see a lot of men sort of slipping away, particularly as they were passing through the countryside that they perhaps knew quite well. The Royalist cavalry in particular were seizing property, blocking people from joining the rebels, and generally making life difficult for them. There's quite an interesting quote I've got from quite a famous Quaker, John Whiting, who lived at Nailsea, in fact, and he left a vivid description of the arrival of one such Royalist patrol in the village of Long Sutton, for those of you who know the place. And I quote, "Terror marched before them, for one could hear their horses grind the ground under their feet almost a mile before they came. They then ransacked the house of Captain Tucker, one of the rebels, cutting and tearing the beds, hangings and furniture to pieces, shaking up the feathers and carrying away the bedsticks and what else they could, letting out the beer, wine and cider about the cellar and setting fire to a barn." And of course, the rebel army just wasn't strong enough to stop those sort of deprivations. Right. This is a modern picture of Sedgemoor, which, as you probably all know, is about 3 miles outside Bridgewater. And this
wasn't it there?
The town of Bridgewater, they started half-heartedly to improve the defences as if they were going to resist a siege. But I mean, that just wasn't really possible. That would be a fool's errand. But a local farmer suggested to Monmouth that the Royalist army would be vulnerable to a surprise attack. Now, the Royalist army was actually camped at Weston Zoyland, which, as I say, is about 3 miles outside of Bridgewater. And this local farmer suggested that a night attack on their camp could be a way of extracting victory from the jaws of defeat. Now, any of you with any military bent know that a surprise night attack is perhaps the most difficult military manoeuvre to effect. Nevertheless, the rebel army, which probably numbered, shall we say, 4,500, something of that order, came out of Bridgewater and looped to the north to attack the Royalist camp from the north. So they were tramping in total silence across territory such as this, the very flat lands around Sedgemoor. And of course, a key part of it, again, of those who know the country, is that the land is crisscrossed by a whole series of drainage ditches called rhines. And it was particularly important that they found the right crossing points for these rhines to actually get to attack the Royalist camp. And they did remarkably well, given the circumstances. These amateur soldiers managed to march in fairly good order for several miles across this uncharted territory, as far as they were concerned, to come upon the Royalist camp from the rear. Inevitably, though, professional soldiers that they were, they'd set out sentries and pickets, and the attack was discovered. A mounted sentry fired his pistol to warn the camp of the approaching army, and all surprise was lost. Now, one legend that I want to totally and utterly refute, and if you take one thing away from this talk tonight, please take this one. It's been disparagingly termed the Pitchfork Rebellion. Now, anybody who thinks it through for 5 seconds will realise that a pitchfork is not exactly a terribly effective weapon. It's short, it's not as wieldy as a sword, it's a remarkably poor weapon to go to war with. The improvised weapons they did actually use were based on scythes, and there's a picture of a scythe in its proper use at the top of the screen. And obviously you use it in a swinging motion to cut corn. So what they did was to actually turn it through 90 degrees, turn the blade through 90 degrees, as you can see from the picture on the left of the man holding one, attach it to about an 8-foot long pole, and you've got quite a lethal spear type weapon. Now, they've not actually been used in this country before, but a lot of the continental wars, particularly Eastern Europe, there'd been an absolutely lethal weapon in the hands of disciplined and well-motivated peasants. If you can imagine what a scythe held out at 45 degrees would do to the underside of a charging horse, then I'll leave that to your imagination. The picture on the right is, in fact, it's a church in Northamptonshire, where uniquely they've got 12 scythe blades that have been converted into weapons. Nobody knows why, but again, it gives you a fairly good idea as to what they would look like. So if you're going to disparage this rebel army, you really ought to call it the Scythe Rebellion, not the Pitchfork Rebellion. Again, as a slight detour, it's an interesting aspect that most of the Royalist Army was still equipped with matchlock muskets. Picture one here, where in the close-up you can see that there was a bit of cord which was lit, burning, and the gun was fired by that being pushed down onto the gunpowder underneath it when the trigger is pressed. So fairly unreliable and going out of fashion, going out of use at this time, but a lot of the Royalist Army was still equipped with them. The rebels, by contrast, had a fair number of flintlock muskets, which they brought over from Low Country with them, where you had a flint striking and causing the spark to set off the gunpowder. Very much more reliable and effective. Anyway, back to the battle. The battle started before daybreak, really, because, as I say, the two armies were really drawn up in darkness. The rebels stood their ground. They deployed and stood their ground. They were fairly short of ammunition and were fairly ill-disciplined in terms of using it. And again, a musket like the one we're looking at had an effective range at most of 400 yards. The two sides were perhaps 100 yards apart, but even at that range, it took quite a skilled man to actually hit anything, and very few casualties were caused on the Royalist Army by that. However, the rebels did have 3 small cannon, a bit like these. This is a reenactment, obviously, but 3 cannon along these lines, which did cause a fair number of casualties among the Royalist Army, which is probably bad news because, of course, the Royalist Army then got a bit annoyed at seeing their mates being killed, and when the battle turned, they were a bit annoyed at this. The rebel cavalry, such as it was, were driven from the battlefield very early on. Again, if you think about it, I mean, it's fairly straightforward to train a rider to be brave if they feel they've got God on their side. You don't teach a horse in 2 weeks to withstand cannon fire, the flashes of gunfire, smoke, and so on and so forth. The horses they were riding, there were about 800, they think, rebel cavalry. Some may have been plough horses or cart horses, but most of them probably were riding horses that had been seized in the towns and the villages. But they were no match at all for professional cavalry and really took no part in the battle. Inevitably, the rebels got defeated. The battle, such as it was fought either side of one of these rhines, a drainage ditch like this modern one, perhaps a bit deeper. It proved to be a barrier for the rebels, but the trained military of the Royalist forces just basically charged straight through it. It was only waist deep or something, and they got across it without any great difficulty. Again, as an aside of history, at least a couple of the regiments of the Royalist Army had until recently served in Tangier in North Africa, insofar as Charles II had received Tangier as part of the dowry for his wife, and it had been an English colony for about 20 years. Now, not many people know that, but perhaps not surprisingly, it didn't prove to be a terribly profitable colony. And in 1684, Charles actually abandoned it. But what it did mean is that a couple of the regiments of the Royalist Army were hard men. They were used to, dare I say it, dealing with natives. And again, I would perhaps draw the analogy of the way the Paras in Londonderry handled the civilian population on Bloody Sunday during the Troubles in Ireland.